The temperature had dropped to -18 by the time the last bus pulled away from University Avenue, and inside St. Michael's Hospital, the heating vents were working so hard that Hazel Kovach could hear them humming through the pharmacy walls like something trying to talk. January in Toronto always did this, pressed the cold in from every direction until even the air inside felt borrowed. She'd been standing behind the dispensary counter for 6 hours, her feet aching in her rubber-soled shoes, the fluorescent lights above making everything look a little worse than it actually was. She'd been working the overnight shift at the hospital pharmacy for 14 months, long enough to know which residents ordered narcotics without checking the chart twice, long enough to recognize the particular quiet that settled over the building at 2 in the morning, when the day staff had gone home and the hallways stretched out empty and pale under the emergency lighting. Long enough, too, to notice when something in that quiet changed. Gus Pemberton was on duty with her, a pharmacist in his late 50s who wore the same green cardigan most nights and always had a travel mug of decaf that he never quite finished. He was a calm man, the kind who moved slowly on purpose, and Hazel had come to depend on his steadiness, the way you depend on a wall being where you left it. She'd come to Toronto from Winnipeg 2 years ago. If anyone asked, and most people at the hospital had stopped asking, she'd say she needed a change of scenery. She'd say she'd wanted something bigger, a teaching hospital, more hours. What she didn't say was that her real name was Hazel Vance, that she'd filed the paperwork to use her mother's maiden name, Kovach. At the same time, she'd packed 2 bags and bought a one-way bus ticket east, that she'd done it because the people who had killed her brother Felix were still out there, and one of them had looked directly at her across a parking lot in Transcona 3 weeks after Felix's funeral, and she'd understood immediately that she was not safe. Felix had been 22. He'd been trying to pay off a debt, the kind that comes from making bad choices when you're young and broke, and someone tells you it's just a few deliveries, nothing serious. He'd gotten in over his head with people who worked for a man named Victor Braille, and when Felix had tried to walk away from it, Victor Braille's people had made sure walking away wasn't an option. Hazel had known something was wrong before she'd gotten the call. She'd felt it the way you feel weather changing, a pressure behind the eyes, a tightness in the chest that doesn't have a clear cause. She'd driven to the address Felix had mentioned in a text she hadn't fully understood until it was too late. She'd parked a block away. She'd seen things she couldn't unsee. And then she'd run. 2 years of running had made her very good at watching rooms. She noticed exits first, the way some people notice windows. She noticed when someone's hands were too still inside their coat pockets. She noticed the difference between someone who was waiting for a person and someone who was waiting for a moment. That was why, at 2:15 on a Thursday morning in January, she noticed the 2 men near the east lobby doors. They'd been there for almost 40 minutes. She'd clocked them on her first scan of the waiting area, a habit she couldn't break, when she'd gone to retrieve a printed form from the front counter. They weren't together, or they were pretending not to be. One stood near the vending machines, a coffee cup in his hand that he hadn't drunk from in at least 20 minutes. The other sat in a plastic chair by the window, his phone face down on his knee, his eyes moving in a pattern that had nothing to do with the room itself, and everything to do with the main corridor. He was clocking the entrance. He was waiting for someone specific to come through it. Hazel went back to the dispensary and said nothing to Gus. She filled 2 prescriptions on autopilot, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her mind worked through what she was seeing. She told herself it was nothing. She'd told herself that before, and she'd been wrong. 20 minutes later, the man in the charcoal overcoat came through the main doors with 3 people behind him. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples and the kind of face that suggested he'd spent a lot of his life making decisions under pressure and had come to find that comfortable. He wore his coat the way men wore confidence, like it was simply his. His 3 companions were younger, alert, arranged around him at intervals that were too precise to be accidental. One of them spoke quietly into a phone. Another let his gaze move across the waiting area in a sweep that was exactly the same sweep Hazel used when she entered a room. She recognized the shape of it. She'd seen it around her brother, near the end. The tall man approached the dispensary counter. He'd called ahead. Gus had mentioned it an hour ago, a prescription phoned in by a private physician for a patient who would come after midnight. An emergency refill, blood pressure medication, nothing unusual except the hour. Dorian Carver, the man said when he reached the counter, and he said it quietly, without the edge of someone who expected the name to open doors. Just a man giving information. I have a prescription called in by Dr. Hennessy. Of course, Hazel said. She pulled up the file. Her hands were steady. She was very practiced at making her hands steady. "One moment, Mr. Carver." She processed the prescription. She put the medication in the paper bag, folded the top, printed the receipt. And while she was doing that, while her hands were doing the familiar work, she was watching the east lobby. The man by the vending machines had straightened. He was watching Dorian Carver's back. The man in the chair had put his phone in his pocket. Hazel had heard a phone call she wasn't meant to hear. Once, she'd been standing in a parking lot in Winnipeg, and a man 3 cars away had spoken into his phone with the same flat functional urgency she'd later heard, described as operational in news coverage of Felix's inquest. She'd heard the words "he's here," and 4 total, and she'd felt a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature in Manitoba in October. She felt it now. Her pen was already in her hand. She'd been initialing the dispensary log. It took her 4 seconds to write 8 words on the back of the printed receipt, in small, careful letters near the bottom, under the pharmacy address, East Lobby. 2 men watching you. Loading dock, now. She folded the receipt twice and tucked it into the paper bag. She folded the top and sealed it with a sticker. "Mr. Carver," she said, and she passed the bag across the counter, and she met his eyes for exactly 1 second before she looked back at her screen. "You'll want to check the dosage information inside. There are some notes from the pharmacist." There were no notes from the pharmacist. Gus was in the back room. Dorian Carver took the bag. He looked at it for a moment, then at her, and something in his expression shifted. Not much, not in a way anyone else would catch, but Hazel had spent 2 years reading small signals. He understood that she'd said something she wasn't saying out loud. "Thank you," he said. "I appreciate the attention to detail." He turned to the man closest to him and said something in a low voice. Then, without any visible urgency, the group changed direction, not toward the east lobby, not toward the main entrance, but down the side corridor that led to the service elevator and the loading dock. Hazel turned back to her screen. Her heart was hammering so hard she was certain Gus could hear it from the back room. She didn't watch what happened next. She counted inventory labels. She logged 2 returned prescriptions. She refilled Gus's label printer with a new roll of tape when it ran out. She kept her eyes on the counter. 15 minutes later, the man by the vending machines made a phone call. He was agitated. The man by the window stood up, looked around the empty lobby, and they exchanged a look that meant the plan had collapsed. Then they left. Hazel exhaled for what felt like the first time in 20 minutes. Gus came out of the back room and asked if she wanted him to do the 4 o'clock restock, and she said yes, please. And she was so grateful for the ordinary shape of the question that she almost couldn't answer it. When she walked out of the hospital at 6:15 into the grey pre-dawn cold, the snowbanks lining University Avenue were pale and untouched. The street was empty. A single transit bus moved through the intersection ahead, its windows orange and bright against the dark. Hazel walked to the subway and told herself she'd done the right thing. She also told herself she'd probably just ended the careful, quiet life she'd spent 2 years building. She was right on both counts. She lay in her apartment on Gerrard Street, a 1-bedroom she'd furnished slowly and practically, nothing that couldn't be left behind in a hurry, and watched the light change on the ceiling and listened to the building's radiators knock and hiss. She thought about Felix. She thought about the last conversation they'd had, a week before he died, when she'd told him to stop, told him it wasn't worth it, and he'd said she worried too much. She'd spent 2 years wondering if that was true. At 8:30 that morning, she got a text from a number she didn't recognize, the pharmacy. "When does your shift start?" She stared at it for a long time. 5 p.m. The reply came immediately, "I'll be there at 4. Dorian Carver looked different in daylight. Hazel had seen him briefly in the fluorescent overcast of the pharmacy, in the specific kind of light that flattens everything. In the afternoon, with the low winter sun coming through the dispensary windows, she could see the lines around his eyes, the careful way he held himself, like a man who'd learned not to take up more space than necessary, despite being exactly the kind of person rooms rearranged themselves around. He was alone this time, no companions, no men in formation. He set his coat over the back of the chair across the counter and sat down, and looked at her, and waited. "You shouldn't be here," Hazel said. "No," he agreed. "Neither should you, probably. And yet," he looked around the dispensary. "Gus wasn't in yet. Last night. How did you know?" "I didn't know anything. I noticed something that didn't look right. Most people wouldn't have. I'm not most people." He considered that. "No, I don't think you are." He set both hands flat on the counter, a deliberate gesture, like he was showing her he wasn't holding anything she should be worried about. "They ran your photo this morning," My people. I have people who do that. I hope you'll forgive the intrusion. Hazel's stomach went cold. Your name came back as Hazel Kovacs, he continued, but that's not your original name, is it? You changed it through the courts about 26 months ago. You used to live in Winnipeg. You had a brother named Felix Vance. She didn't say anything. Victor Braille, Dorian said, and the name landed in the space between them like something dropped from a height. Hazel's hands gripped the counter edge. I don't want to talk about Victor Braille. I know you don't. I also know that Victor Braille's people were the two men in the East lobby last night, and I know they weren't there for you. They were there for me, which means whatever you saw, you weren't wrong. He paused. Thank you, by the way, for doing that. You didn't have to. No, she said quietly, I didn't. Why did you? The question sat there. She'd spent the whole sleepless night preparing for it, and still the honest answer came out before she could replace it with something safer. Because no one warned my brother, she said. Because he walked into something he didn't understand, and nobody who saw it coming said a word. And I've spent 2 years thinking about what might have been different if someone had. She met his eyes. I couldn't save Felix, but maybe I could say something when I still had the chance, even to someone like you. Someone you know nothing about who operates in complicated spaces. I was going to say powerful, but sure. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the nearest approach to one. I run a pharmaceutical company, a legitimate one now. It wasn't always uncomplicated. He said that last word carefully, like he was choosing it precisely. Victor Braille runs an operation that extends through most of Western Canada and is pushing east. He has interests in counterfeit medication supply chains that move through real hospital networks. I've been working with the RCMP's Organized Crime Task Force for the past 3 years to build a case against him. He watched her face. Your brother's death is in that case file. The words hit her somewhere below the ribcage. He's not a footnote, Dorian added. He's evidence. His name is in documents that will matter when Braille goes to trial. But Braille knows a case is being built. He's been eliminating connections. Last night was his second attempt on my life. He said it plainly, without drama. When you saved me, Hazel, you also reminded his people that there's someone working the overnight pharmacy shift who knows how to read a room. They don't know why you did it, but they'll want to find out. The room felt smaller than it had a minute ago. You're telling me I put myself in danger. I'm telling you that you were already in danger. You've been in danger for 2 years. You just didn't know Braille was still keeping a list. He keeps very long lists. He looked at her steadily. I'd like to help you, and I'd like to ask for your help in return if you're willing. That sounds like a negotiation. It is one. I'm not going to pretend it's anything else. Hazel looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her apartment on Gerrard Street. She thought about the bag she'd kept packed for 2 years, sitting at the back of her closet under a shelf of extra linen, because she'd never fully believed she was safe enough to unpack it. I already called the RCMP, she said. Dorian went very still. When? This morning. I asked for the organized crime line. I left a message with a Sergeant Theresa Kamau. I told her I had information about Victor Braille and that I needed to speak to someone before I said anything more. He was quiet for a moment. Then, Theresa Kamau is the officer I've been working with for the past 18 months. Hazel blinked. You found the right person, he said slowly. That's either very good instincts or extraordinary luck. Probably both, she said. I've been keeping notes for 2 years. What I saw in Winnipeg. Dates, descriptions, partial license plates. Things I was too frightened to give anyone when I still lived there. She kept her voice flat, practical, because if she let the emotion into it, she'd lose the thread. I thought if I was going to do this, I was going to do it properly, not just keep hiding. Dorian looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had changed, less managed, more human. My father started Carver Health Group in 1987. He built it clean. 30 years of clean. Braille approached him in 2018, wanted to use our distribution network for product that wasn't what the labels said. My father refused. Braille made things very difficult afterward. He paused. My father died in 2020. The coroner said heart failure. I have reason to believe it wasn't. He said it without inflection, but Hazel heard everything underneath it. I've been trying to hold the company together and build a case at the same time. It's been a lot to carry. I know something about that, Hazel said. They looked at each other across the counter. Two people who'd been carrying the weight of other people's choices for a long time. Both tired of it, both still standing. What do you need from me? She asked. Your testimony, what you witnessed in Winnipeg, your help speaking with Sergeant Kamau and giving her the full picture, names, dates, Everything you've been holding on to. He held her gaze. Let the RCMP use it properly. Give them what they need to make this stick. I was already going to do that. Then we're already aligned. He set a plain white card on the counter, just a phone number, nothing else. If anything happens before you speak with Kamau, you call that number. My people will respond. I'm not sure I trust your people. That's fair. Trust is built, not given. He stood, picked up his coat. For what it's worth, I don't trust easily either, but I trusted you last night when you handed me that bag. I walked out through a loading dock in a January snowstorm because a pharmacy technician I'd never met wrote 8 words on a receipt. He paused. Some things are worth the risk. He left through the main entrance. Hazel looked down at the card on the counter. She put it in her apron pocket. Sergeant Teresa Kamau was a compact, careful woman who spoke in precise sentences and wrote everything in a small notebook she held at an angle so you couldn't read it. She met Hazel at a Tim Hortons on King Street 2 days later, far enough from the hospital that nobody who worked there would see them, close enough to a transit stop that Hazel had 3 exit routes planned before she sat down. They talked for 2 hours. Hazel told Sergeant Kamau everything. The parking lot in Transcona, the faces she'd seen. The name spoken into a phone by a man who didn't know she could hear him. Victor Braille, said twice, flat and familiar. The partial license plate she'd memorized and kept in her phone for 2 years, labeled recipe in case anyone looked. Sergeant Kamau wrote without expression and asked clean, specific questions, and at the end said, Mrs. Vance or Miss Kovac, whichever you prefer. What you've just given me corroborates testimony from 2 other witnesses who were too frightened to file official statements. You are not the only person who has been watching and waiting. She closed the notebook. We can move on this. It won't be quick, but it will stick. Dorian Carver, Hazel said. Is he trustworthy? Sergeant Kamau considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Complicated, she said finally. His company's history is complicated, but in 3 years working with our task force, he's been consistent. He's given us things he didn't have to give and asked for very little in return. She looked at Hazel. He filed a protection request for you the morning after you helped him, before you even called us. Hazel sat with that for a moment. That's not nothing, Sergeant Kamau said. No, Hazel agreed, it's not. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Hazel's adult life. She kept working her shifts. She kept filling prescriptions and logging inventory and refilling Gus's label printer, and the whole time the RCMP task force was building a case around Victor Braille, like scaffolding going up around a building you intend to take apart. Dorian checked in by text every few days, not intrusively, not with the urgency of someone who needed something, just short messages. Kamau says things are moving. How are you holding up? She always answered honestly. He came by the pharmacy once, on a Thursday, and they talked for half an hour in the break room, while Gus pretended to be very interested in the supply order. They talked about Felix, and about Dorian's father, and about what it was like to carry grief and fury in the same hand for years without anyone knowing it. Dorian said he hadn't slept a full night in 4 years. Hazel said she'd never properly unpacked the bag at the back of her closet. He said, maybe that changes soon. She said maybe. Victor Braille was arrested on a Tuesday in March, along with 11 members of his organization. The charges included fraud, conspiracy, and a list that ran 2 pages and would take 2 years to work through the courts. Sergeant Kamau called Hazel at 7 in the morning and said, It's done. I wanted you to hear it from me first. Hazel sat on the edge of her bed and cried for the first time in longer than she could remember. Not because it was over, but because it had meant something. Because Felix's name was in a document that had helped put Victor Braille in handcuffs. Because it hadn't been for nothing. She called her mother that afternoon and used her real name. On a Thursday in April, Hazel walked to the pharmacy without checking over her shoulder. She did it consciously, deliberately, letting herself move through the morning crowd on Gerrard Street, without scanning faces, without clocking exits, without the low-grade alertness that had been running in the background of her nervous system for 2 years. The city moved around her. It was 7 degrees and the snow was almost gone, the sidewalks grey and gritty with winter sand. Someone down the street was already sitting outside a cafe, which was ambitious in April but very Toronto. She had 40 minutes before her shift started. She turned toward the coffee shop on the corner instead. Dorian Carver was already there. She'd texted him, and he'd replied same, and she was learning that he always arrived first. He had 2 coffees on the table and stood when he saw her, which was also something he always did, and she was learning not to find it strange. Kamau sent the preliminary schedule, he said when she sat down. The first hearings aren't until September. She said you won't need to be there for the early ones. Good, Hazel said. She wrapped both hands around the coffee cup. I unpacked the bag. He looked at her. "The one at the back of my closet," she said. "I unpacked it last night, put everything away properly." She looked out the window at the street, at the ordinary Thursday morning moving past. "I'm going to apply for the full pharmacy technician certification. Not just continuing education, the proper program. I've been putting it off." "You'd be good at it," Dorian said matter-of-factly, like it was simply true. "I think so too," she said. Outside, the city did what it always did, moved and didn't notice them, and went about its 10,000 concerns. Someone's dog investigated a lamppost, a cyclist clipped the curb, swore quietly, and kept going. A kid in a school backpack pressed the crosswalk button 4 times in a row, the way kids always do, like more times makes it faster. Hazel thought about Felix, about his laugh first, the way it came out of him sideways, like he was surprised by it every time. She thought about who he'd been before the end, not just who he'd been at the end. She was getting better at doing that. "Thank you," she said to Dorian, and she meant it in the way that didn't need explaining. "Thank you," he said back, and he meant the same thing. The coffee was hot, the morning was cold. Through the window, Toronto went about its business, indifferent and enormous and ordinary, and Hazel Vance sat in it without hiding, and felt for the first time in 2 years like she was actually in it, not watching from a careful distance. In it. Finally.